What we discovered this past year is the tomb of someone that we believe was the first member of the royal dynasty at Caracol.
Scientists just opened the tomb of the first Maya king, and what they found inside is rewriting the entire story.
This would be the first individual that we found that actually matches with the hieroglyphic text, so the first ruler.
The tomb beneath the jungle what archaeologists discovered during the most recent excavation season is the tomb of an individual believed to be the first member of the royal dynasty at Caracol. Scientists have opened the tomb of what they believe to be the first Maya king, and what they found inside is fundamentally rewriting the accepted historical narrative. This appears to be the first individual discovered who actually corresponds with the hieroglyphic texts, the very first ruler of the dynasty, accompanied by a jadeite death mask. Pacific shells transported from more than 1,000 kilometers away and pressed directly above his bones. A layer that had no business being there, cremated remains and green obsidian from a city 1,000 miles to the northwest. One of the ceramic lids bears a portrait of the god Teotihuacan, the Maya merchant deity, a figure not generally recognized from the classic period. That foreign artifact was sealed into a Maya royal grave decades before central Mexico was supposed to have made contact with the Maya world. The founder of an entire dynasty may not have been Maya at all, and the DNA analysis is about to prove it. The Belizean jungle does not yield its secrets willingly. The humidity settles on the body like a second skin. The forest canopy blocks out the light, and the stone is slick with moss before researchers even reach it. This is the environment in which archaeologists working at Caracol cracked open a sealed burial chamber and came face to face with a presence that had been waiting in the dark for 17 centuries. The face was a mosaic, dozens of jadeite fragments, each one shaped, polished, and fitted into place to form a death mask of a king. The individual pieces were small, some no larger than a fingernail. The mask had survived because the chamber was sealed beneath stone floors, then encased by successive phases of later construction and never disturbed across the centuries that followed. Producing a mosaic of this precision was not a minor undertaking. It was the product of artisans whose entire careers were dedicated to a single craft, knowledge passed from master to apprentice across generations. Each jade piece had to be ground by hand against rough sandstone abrasives, shaped precisely to its neighbors, and bonded firmly into place. Months of concentrated labor in a workshop dedicated exclusively to the king. Every fragment originated from the same geological source. Geochemical analysis tied the jadeite to the Metapua Valley in Guatemala, the only known source of true jadeite in all of Mesoamerica. To the Maya, jade held a value exceeding gold. It was the stone of breath, of maize, of life itself. A king buried in jade was a king claimed by the gods. The jade standard preceded the gold standard because jade also functioned as currency. It was not merely a luxury trade commodity, but the actual monetary medium used in exchange. The raw jade had to be transported hundreds of kilometers from the Metapua River Valley to reach Caracol, crossing rivers and territories controlled by rival polities, carried by porters along forest trails that required many weeks to traverse. Every fragment in that mask was a political object before it ever became a religious one. Around the mask, 11 painted ceramic vessels formed a ring. The merchant god Teotihuacan appeared on one, the rain god Chuck on another. Several depicted bound captives kneeling in ritual defeat, the king's enemies immortalized in clay. The painted glyphs on the vessels echoed conventions seen at Tikal and at sites across the Petan heartland, hundreds of kilometers to the west. These vessels were not decorative objects. They were political documents. The bound captives were not anonymous prisoners, but specifically named enemies whose defeat the king wished to preserve alongside his own remains. Royal authority in the Maya world was something demonstrated through the bodies of opponents and broadcast through artistic proclamation. The vessels in this tomb announced a king who had taken enemies, displayed them, and demanded their submission before consigning them to the gods. That is the first rupture in the official narrative. This was not the grave of a local warlord. The artistry pointed to a king connected to capitals across the entire Maya world, and the next object removed from the chamber pointed somewhere even more unexpected, Asteriska. Small cluster of orange-pink shells lay near the king's skeleton. Spondylus, the kind of shell produced in the cold waters of the Pacific coast, more than 1,000 kilometers from Caracol. Not a short walk, not a neighboring valley. 1,000 kilometers of mountain, jungle, and rival territory separated the Maya lowlands from the divers who retrieved these shells from rocky seabeds at depths of 15 meters or more. That discovery produced the first moment of genuine astonishment for the excavation team. Spondylus diving was specialist work, the kind that claimed the lives of divers who pushed too hard. The shells moved through trade networks that crossed every political boundary in ancient Mesoamerica. To find a concentration of them in a single early Maya tomb indicated that this king possessed genuine influence, the kind that extended to distant coastlines. Spondylus shells were not simply luxury goods. They functioned simultaneously as currency, religious objects, and political tokens. Kings deployed them to cement alliances. Priests offered them to reign deities. Merchants treated them as the premier prestige commodity in long-distance regional exchange. A collection of them in a single tomb was a deliberate statement. Then came the bone tubes, slender, carved, stained red with cinnabar or hematite, used for ritual purposes or as incense containers. Similar tubes have been recovered at Coban and other royal courts, placing that element firmly within recognizable Maya royal traditions, even if the materials were of exceptional quality. As one specialist noted, this tells us that significance resided not only in the finished object, but in the process of making it, the symbolic and ritual meaning embedded in the act of production itself. The ceramic lids were stranger still. 2 lids, each surmounted by the sculpted head of a coatimundi, a nocturnal animal the Maya associated with the underworld, carved from local limestone, but modeled on forms documented at Lubontin, more than 50 kilometers to the south. A potter at Caracol had been trained in or had deliberately copied work from a city a full day's journey away. The complete inventory continued to expand. Carved bone fragments, worked shell, pigment cakes ground from minerals not found in the local geology. Each individual item could theoretically be explained by trade, by tribute, or by the visit of a single foreign dignitary. Taken together, however, they composed an entirely different portrait. Every piece pointed elsewhere: Pacific Coast, Guatemalan Highlands, Lubontin, Tikal. The deeper the excavation progressed, the less the burial resembled the grave of one Maya city's ruler. It resembled a cartographic rendering of the entire Mesoamerican world expressed in objects. For a tomb sealed in the early 300 CE before Caracol had achieved the regional dominance it would later command, the geographic reach implied was extraordinary. This was a king capable of calling in obligations from coastlines, mountain ranges, and rival capitals alike. And that was only the inventory inside the chamber. The most significant problem was situated in the layer directly above it. The numbers that established the Dynasty radiocarbon results returned with exceptional precision. 2 charcoal samples extracted from the tomb's primary fill were sent to the University of Arizona's Accelerator Mass Spectrometry Laboratory. The reported measurements were 815 plus or minus 30 radiocarbon years before present, and 822 plus or minus 32 when calibrated. Those readings converged on a window between 330 and 350 CE with more than 95% confidence. The University of Arizona AMS facility is among the most respected radiocarbon laboratories in the world. Their measurements serve as benchmarks for other institutions, and a 95% confidence interval on a calibrated date of this age represents the practical limit of what the technology can achieve. When results from that laboratory come back this tight, there is no basis for disagreement. That window falls squarely within the early Classic period, the precise interval during which Caracol's dynasty was founded. According to inscriptions later kings carved into the city's stele, the dating is not ambiguous. It represents one of the tightest archaeological windows attainable for a tomb of this antiquity. A separate independent analysis was conducted by ceramic specialist Dr. Maria Gonzalez. She examined the 11 painted vessels without reference to the radiocarbon results, analyzing rim profiles, slip colors, glyph blocks, and every measurable characteristic against a comparative database of thousands of Maya ceramics. Her conclusion placed the vessels within the Caracol Classic phase, roughly 280 to 380 CE, without ambiguity. The vessel forms, she noted in her written assessment, are unmistakable for that chronological horizon. Physical reconstruction of the fragments alone required years of painstaking work, joining pieces one by one despite knowing they belonged together. Two entirely independent methods, conducted by two entirely independent laboratories, produced results landing in the same temporal window. When radiocarbon dating and ceramic typology converge this cleanly, the date is effectively fixed. No interpretive flexibility remains. And that window corresponds to the reign of one specific king, Teotihuacan. The individual Caracols, later rulers identified as the founder of their dynasty and the figure to whom they trace their authority on every monument raised across the subsequent centuries. The dynasty's first king now had a confirmed date. He simply did not yet have a name established through his own physical remains. And the next phase of excavation was about to make that identification extraordinarily difficult to resolve through conventional means, a tomb constructed to anchor a city. Chamber occupied the northernmost edge of Caracol's palace platform. That positioning was deliberate. In Maya urban planning, the northern terminus was the designated location for the burial of a dynastic founder. North represented the realm of ancestors, the direction from which legitimate authority descended to the living. Placing the founder there constituted a spatial argument. The dynasty rests, literally and physically, upon these bones. The excavation records clarified the engineering. The burial chamber had been sealed beneath a secondary stone floor, then enclosed by later monumental construction, then buried under successive additional layers. Successive kings raised platforms, plazas, and pyramids directly above the founder's tomb across the following centuries. None of them disturbed it. The chamber was architecturally inviolable. The Acropolis's massive defensive walls came later in the city's development. The tomb came first. Everything Caracol subsequently became, the bowl courts, the causeways, the stelae lining the plazas, grew outward from this single sealed room. Moving through the city was a form of perpetual pilgrimage toward the man interred beneath one's feet. This was not a peripheral burial, not an addition to an existing structure. The tomb was the generative seed from which the entire urban core developed, the architectural and ideological point of origin for a city that would eventually rival Tikal. As one of the most powerful capitals in the Maya world, Caracol at its peak sustained a population exceeding 100,000 people across an urban grid of causeways and agricultural terraces. Every one of those residents lived, in some meaningful sense, within the gravitational field of this single chamber. The pattern recurs at other Maya capitals. At Tikal, at Palenque, at Copan, the founder's grave functions as the architectural anchor of the city as a whole. Caracol conforms to that pattern but executed it at a scale that permanently embedded the founder's chamber beneath the city's operational center. Maya inscriptions document later kings communing with their ancestors, opening portals to the underworld through ritual, performance, and drawing political legitimacy directly from the remains beneath the floors. Regarding the ritual significance of water features at the site, one researcher observed, if we consider the ritualism and the cosmogony involved, these spaces were actively used to present offerings to the gods. The dead were not absent. They were active participants in the political life of the living, named on stelae, invoked at ceremonies, called upon to authorize wars and validate peace agreements. That is what rendered the founder's tomb sacred. Not the physical remains themselves, but the political function those remains performed. The authority they transmitted to every subsequent king by virtue of their proximity to that single chamber, that one set of remains, that one sealed room beneath the city's heart. The founder's grave was the axis around which the entire city organized itself. And then archaeologists reached the layer directly above the tomb, and the standard Maya historical narrative ceased to function, the layer that should not exist compressed. Immediately above the royal burial was a stratum of ash and fragmented bone, compacted by centuries of overlying weight and unmistakable in what it signified, cremation. The lowland Maya did not cremate their dead. They interred them intact. The physical body served as the vessel for the soul's passage through the underworld, and it was not burned. Cremation was associated with a different cultural tradition entirely with Teotihuacan, the great metropolis situated 1,000 miles to the northwest in the central highlands of Mexico. At Teotihuacan, cremation was a prerogative reserved for the uppermost ranks of society. Discovering cremated remains positioned directly above the tomb of Caracol's founder was the first indication that something fundamental was wrong with the accepted historical framework. This was not a misapplication of Maya funerary custom. This was a foreign rite performed correctly by individuals who understood its meaning, and it was performed directly atop the founder's grave, sealed in place by the same construction phase that protected the chamber below. Whoever performed this rite had sanctioned access. Whoever performed it was accorded significant honor. Cremation in the central Mexican highlands was not a casual procedure. It required specific bundling rituals, specific spatial orientations, specific treatment of the ash residue, and the substantial fuel investment needed to fully reduce a human body to calcined bone. Performing it correctly required individuals raised within that tradition or formally trained in it. One does not improvise central Mexican cremation in the Belizean jungle. Mixed among the charred remains, archaeologists recovered fragments of green obsidian. Geochemical analysis traced that obsidian to the Pachuca region, the volcanic slopes in close proximity to Teotihuacan itself. This was not the Guatemalan highland obsidian that constituted the primary Maya supply. Pachuca obsidian was controlled and distributed by Teotihuacan through elite channels, functioning as a state-managed export that communicated political status as directly as it represented commodity trade. Then came the mirror, polished, black, flawless, cut from iron pyrite. This is precisely the variety of mirror Teotihuacan elites carried as components of their formal regalia, the kind their priests regarded as portals to the divine and ancestral realms. Maya rulers did not use these objects. There is no local antecedent, no gradual developmental sequence traceable from earlier lowland forms. The mirror appears in this tomb fully realized, as though transported intact from 1,000 miles distant. Pyrite mirrors required specialized production labor. The mineral had to be cut, polished against progressively finer abrasives, and mounted within worked frames. Teotihuacan workshops produced them in quantity for the city's elite population. Outside Teotihuacan, such objects are rare and almost invariably associated with documented elite contact with the Central Highlands. The presence of one in a Maya tomb sealed before 378 C is the category of find that typically compels archaeologists to undertake extraordinary verification procedures before proceeding to publication. The dating then completed the disruption. These objects were sealed within this tomb decades before 378 CE. That year matters because 378 C is the date of the documented Teotihuacan entrada, the moment when Central Mexican influence is conventionally understood to have arrived in the Maya world. When foreign agents are recorded entering Tikal and restructuring its ruling dynasty, that is the established account. That is the chronology reproduced in every survey of Maya history. The entrada is not a marginal episode. It is the watershed event in early classic Maya political history. Tikal's own inscriptions record the arrival of an individual called Siajkak, sometimes rendered as Fire is Born, who appeared with Central Mexican iconography, Central Mexican weaponry, and within a single year had displaced Tikal's existing ruling family. The 378 C entrada is, according to the inscriptions, the moment the Maya world became a Teotihuacan-influenced world. But this tomb predates that event by an entire generation. Consider that carefully. The tomb of Caracol's founder, sealed somewhere between 330 and 350 CE, contains cremated remains, Pachuca obsidian, and a Teotihuacan-style pyrite mirror. The 378 C entrada has not yet occurred. The textbook arrival of Central Mexican influence remains decades in the future. And yet here these objects are locked into a Maya royal grave, sealed beneath stone floors, and disturbed for 17 centuries, waiting for excavators to uncover them and recognize that the chronology does not correspond to the accepted model. The fundamental question becomes this: how does a Maya royal burial sealed before the documented arrival of Central Mexican influence come to contain cremated remains, Pachuca obsidian, and a Teotihuacan-style pyrite mirror? Arlen Chase, who has worked at Caracol for more than 4 decades alongside Diane Chase, has cautioned in his published scholarship against characterizing Teotihuacan as a conquering power that swept into the Maya world in a single dramatic episode. Caracol was entirely unknown until 1937, and as Chase has reflected, Introduction to Maya Civilization reveals how profoundly limited our understanding has been. The pattern he identifies is considerably more complex: shifting alliances, elite gift exchange, strategic marriages, religious missions, a network within which Caracol's founders operated as participants in a world shaped by distant powers without being subjected to those powers. That interpretive framing matters because it determines what the tomb's contents are demonstrating. If Teotihuacan was engaged in military conquest, the artifacts represent tribute or imposition. If Teotihuacan was engaged in diplomatic networking, the artifacts represent gifts, marriage alliances, and political partnerships. Identical objects, divergent interpretations. Fundamentally different histories, the laboratory analysis that will decide the question within a climate-controlled facility. Laboratory technicians are isolating a fragment of petrous bone from the king's skull. The petrous is the densest component of the human skeleton, a biological vault that preserves DNA for 1,700 years even in the warm, humid soils of the Belizean jungle, long after softer skeletal elements have lost all recoverable genetic material. The petrous bone has transformed ancient DNA research over the past decade. Skeletal remains that earlier extraction techniques had classified as too degraded for productive analysis are now yielding usable genetic sequences. The petrous bone converted every previously dismissed skeleton into a viable candidate for genetic sequencing, fundamentally opening early human migration history to scientific investigation. The clean room protocol is uncompromising. Filtered air circulation, ultraviolet sterilization, full protective suits, every surface chemically treated before contact. A single cell from a modern researcher is sufficient to contaminate a sample irretrievably. The extraction employs a silica-based methodology. The DNA libraries are double-indexed, and every sequencing run is evaluated for one specific signature, cytosine deamination at fragment termini. That chemical pattern constitutes the diagnostic fingerprint of genuinely ancient DNA. When the damage pattern is absent, the sample is classified as modern contamination and discarded. When it is present, the analysis proceeds. In a parallel laboratory, a tooth from the same skeleton is being sampled for strontium and oxygen isotopes. Tooth enamel forms during childhood and permanently encodes the chemical signature of water and food consumed during those developmental years. By measuring strontium and oxygen isotopic ratios, researchers can determine a person's geographic origin, where they were raised, what geological substrate underlay their environment, what water sources they consumed. If this king grew up in the Maya lowlands, his dental enamel will confirm it. If he was raised elsewhere, his teeth will identify that origin regardless of what his tomb's contents suggest. Strontium ratios in central Mexico are chemically distinct from those characteristic of the Maya lowlands. Any difference, if present, will be detectable. The isotopic analysis proceeds more rapidly than ancient DNA work. Several weeks of sample preparation, a limited number of mass spectrometer runs, and a definitive number. That result alone may resolve the core question before the genomic analysis reaches completion. If strontium points to the Mexican highlands, the DNA result functions as confirmation. If it points to the lowland Maya region, the DNA analysis reorients toward investigating deeper ancestry rather than the king's place of birth and upbringing. As Dr. Alvarez, who is leading the analysis as principal investigator, has stated, the team will collect ancient DNA samples at systematic intervals throughout the deposit. And many mysteries remain for which the research may begin to provide answers. The samples remain under Belizean governmental stewardship, appropriately so. No results will be released until peer review is complete and the Belizean government has formally cleared publication. The protocol is rigorous because the consequences of error are severe. A false positive would not merely embarrass a research institution. It would rewrite Maya history on a foundation of methodological failure. And correcting that record could require decades of subsequent scholarship. Asterisk to scenarios. One answer to scenarios now confront the scientific team. In the first scenario, the DNA clusters with lowland Maya populations. The Teotihuacan associated artifacts become evidence of alliance and commercial exchange. A Maya king who incorporated exotic goods and high-status foreign customs into his court. Without abandoning his own cultural identity, the cremation layer above the tomb becomes attributable to a foreign dignitary. An honored guest from the Central Highlands interred alongside his Maya host and accompanying the king into the afterlife as a ritual partner. The standard chronology survives, enriched with greater nuance regarding how influence propagated between cities and how early those connections were already established and functioning. In the second scenario, the DNA matches Central Highland Mexican population profiles. Caracol's founding dynasty was established by a foreigner originating 1,000 miles distant. The standard chronology of Central Mexican influence in the Maya world is displaced by a full generation. Other Maya cities come under renewed analytical scrutiny. Other founders commemorated on stelae as indigenous leaders may prove to have been something categorically different. The political geography of early Mesoamerica requires comprehensive revision. Every existing survey of Maya history requires a substantially rewritten opening chapter. There is no neutral outcome available. There is no result that any reasonable scholar can dismiss or minimize. The molecular evidence will arrive with the force of a decisive verdict. The peer review process will require considerable time. The Belizean government maintains its own approval procedures. The data must be examined, re-examined, and evaluated by independent reviewers and journal editors before public release. But the work is actively proceeding in real research laboratories on genuine samples recovered from a genuine Belizean tomb. The answer is approaching. It is solely a matter of when. The samples remain under Belizean stewardship, as they should. No results will be released before peer review is complete and governmental clearance has been obtained. The scientific community is awaiting testimony from a king who has been silent for 1,700 years and is now finally positioned to speak. This burial has been recognized among the most significant archaeological discoveries of 2025 in preliminary assessments, though that recognition is not the central point. The point is what physical remains can establish that inscriptions cannot. For centuries, the early Maya historical record has been composed by the politically victorious kings inscribing their own legitimacy into stone. Painted vessels commissioned by those in power to glorify those in power. Inscriptions written and recopied by individuals whose professional function was to render the dynasty's ascendancy appear inevitable and natural. As one researcher observed regarding recent remote sensing work at the site, when the LiDAR results became available, they were extraordinary. Suddenly, researchers had genuine spatial control and could identify structural features previously invisible beneath the forest canopy. The defeated were erased. Complexities were resolved into simpler narratives. Foreign influences were recast as indigenous achievement. Molecules, however, neither deceive nor flatter. When the genomic and isotopic data return, they will produce one conclusion or its alternative. No version of the result preserves the standard chronology intact. Either the Teotihuacan-associated artifacts are recharacterized as evidence of an undocumented alliance, or the dynasty's founder is recharacterized as an individual whose origins the inscriptions deliberately omitted. In either case, the history Caracol's later kings carved into their stelae was incomplete. They had compelling political reasons to maintain that incompleteness. Founders are more effectively mythologized when reduced to names and titles rather than full biographical accounts with geographically inconvenient origins. Asterisk. The molecular evidence is about to restore the complexity that was edited out. And once the answer is established, the subsequent questions proliferate. If Caracol's founder proves to be of foreign origin, the same question applies to Tikal's founder and to every other early classic Maya capital with central Mexican materials in its founding burials. The identical laboratory methodology, the identical petrous bone sampling, the identical isotopic analysis can be applied to any preserved royal skeleton throughout the lowlands. Caracol is the first in a potential sequence. The remainder of the early classic Maya record may follow or hold firm depending entirely on what the genetic sequencer produces. The jungle continues to maintain its secrets. The only question remaining is which one yields next.